Hi, everyone. This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. And today I'm going to do something pretty interesting. So we are going to view a couple of videos today, and we're going to talk about some of the reconciliations of the Gospels. I'm just noticing my screen sharing is not working properly here. So let me just stop that. We're going to talk about the reconciliation of the Gospels, but I came across a pretty amusing video. Sometimes it's funny when you look at these reviews. So first it was Braxton Hunter did a review of a bunch of different atheists, and then Adam Friended decided that he was going to do a review of Braxton Hunter's review, and it was really amusing. And so I'll actually put the link to that video in this here, but we're going to listen to a portion of that. So let me just bring that up. Hold on one second. I see I got it lost. So hold on. Got to get back to the video. So thank you, everybody. Hey, Susan, nice to see you. Thank you. Here we go. You guys are going to get a good kick out of this. Okay. So let's bring it so we can make sure we hear the sound. All right. Here we go.
So I don't think the atheist community is capable of giving you a decent moral compass. It seems like the LGBT activists come out, they are looking for some kind of support group. They find the atheist community, and the atheist community kind of, I don't know, uses I don't know. It seems like the social justice community uses them as well. So I don't know that it's a great thing. That's why I think religious communities need to find a workaround for this LGBT stuff, because there are other people that are counseling people that aren't really qualified to counsel people.
And then noticed what he goes to next, or who he goes to when he's talking about counseling. I find this amusing. This is Shannon Q up here, if you don't know her, and it says her name right there. Again, this is Braxton Hunter's review.
I want to hide an intrinsic and integral part of myself anymore, because I fear the repercussions that came with those misrepresentations and pronouncements. I didn't want anyone else to have to either.
Shannon Q is another interesting character. I had reached out to her. This is the funny thing about the atheist community too. I had reached out to her when Rationality Rules had done that kind of hit piece on me. And I had reached out to her to try to straighten things out. I'm like, this guy's completely lying about me, and you know that he's lying about me. And if you had any kind of moral compass, you would come clean. You would help me straighten out the miscommunication. Lying is harsh. Miscommunication, let's call it. And Shannon Q just kind of like backstabbed me. It was like, F you. She's like a social climber in the anti-theist community. So it makes sense. Makes sense why she would backstab another YouTuber, but I don't know. I don't like to roll that way. I'm not really in that backstabby camp.
See, what's interesting about Adam Friended is he's an atheist, but he calls himself a Christian atheist. So he likes the Christian values, and he was raised in a Christian family. I kind of wonder if he's going to remain an atheist for very much longer. He doesn't side with anyone particular in that camp. In fact, he tends to ruffle a lot of feathers. That's his MO. And he's got two very huge YouTube channels. He's got one with like 70,000 people, and this one with this video has 40,000. I don't know how he gets so big so fast, because when I talk to him, I've interviewed him and talked to him before. I could have sworn this particular channel was very, very small compared to what it is right now. So he is just sort of, speaking of social climbing, he's definitely climbing his way up there, clawing his way up there into people's living rooms, into their YouTube channel. And so, and I like a lot of the stuff he says. He's got some pretty good insights, especially on people like Jordan Peterson. And I think a lot of his material was on Jordan Peterson, and I think that that's one of the things that sort of got him some attention. And I don't know what other tactics he uses, but whatever he's doing, it's pretty effective. So let's hear him out.
Well, maybe I'm backstabbing her now by bringing this up, but
I wanted to profess the message that it's okay to be us. We can release the stigma only by existing unapologetically and in the open. Now, I know that there are still so many of us for which that cannot yet be a reality, for whom the cost is still too great, and I'm sorry it's not better yet.
Yeah, she's basically making the pitch to the LGBT community. She's saying you're in a religious family and you're gay, and it's difficult for you to talk to your parents, come to us. Come to us. We will help you. We will be your family. We will be your support group. Just like the Non Sequitur show was a support group for so many people until Kyle stole all the money and ran. Beautiful.
I have to say something really funny. He mentioned this a couple times. I'm not going to watch his whole video. I'm going to go up to the 27-minute mark, right around the 27-minute mark. But he mentioned something really funny. As he's talking about Godless Engineer before, and he said of all the people for Godless Engineer to pair up with, Godless Engineer got behind the person who took the money on the Non Sequitur show. So we had Steve and Kyle has actually been ordered by the courts to repay some of that money to Steve. So that's a pretty interesting little insight there. So here we go.
Support group you guys built there.
And I hope that by adding even just one more of us to the public discourse, it's another step towards.
I have the other video that will make us cringe right here. I freshly uploaded, deleted from my channel, full of naughty words and terrible editing.
Shattering the biases people hold that keep so many of us hidden.
And lastly, the evidentialist. Evidence.
Oh, I'm in all these categories.
So what it is Braxton came up with 4 categories of atheists, and Adam's looking at this and saying, wait a second, I relate it to these categories. So he's talking about the evidentialist, the psychologist, and I forget the other categories, but basically, the evidentialist, psychologist, sort of the one that's out there trying to get people's attention, like Shannon. Come back to that.
I'm the evidentialist too. Show me the evidence.
This is at least the stated.
Braxton. Where are these categories? What the hell are these categories? This was one of his more popular videos, but I honestly only think the reason why it was so popular was because it had all these atheists in it, all these YouTube atheists who love to see themselves in videos. So they're like, oh, look.
He just went through the comments, and I saw 2 people I really like. I saw Capturing Christianity, and I saw, and I'm actually going to show a little bit of Capturing Christianity's video today too, because if Nathan Ormond has stopped talking on his channel to Camille, I'm going to show part of their take on Capturing Christianity's channel. I also saw Craig Reed on there, so that was kind of funny. So I see people I know in the comments. So I hadn't listened to this atheist YouTuber video before, so I only saw it fresh from what I see here with Adam.
Putting us in a video. Braxton, do not respond to this video, okay? This video is for me and my fans, for fun. No responses, please.
And primary concern of these atheists. They focus on responses to more sophisticated apologetic arguments and defend atheistic arguments, or arguments against Christianity specifically. You'll often find them cited by atheists that are in the other 3 approaches.
Allow me to hand things over to none other than Cosmo.
This little guy. This guy made a few response videos to me and never used my name or clips from my videos or anything like that, but used the words, the verbiage that I would use to make it clear that he was responding to me just as a little like, you're nobody. That's
apparently this guy who's shown right here, the activist, apparently he was on CNN. Now I find that really interesting. Why CNN, if this is true? I mean, I can't assume it's not. Why CNN would have that guy as a take on what? It'd be curious to find out exactly what he was on CNN saying.
Well, I can't remember his name, but he was like, you're not, I don't want to promote you. That's the social justice angle. They're like, I don't want to platform your ideas. I don't want people finding your channel or interacting with you. I don't want to have an honest debate. I want to call you out in videos and stuff like that, but I don't want people to know I'm calling you out. Little snake this guy is. A little sneaky.
This is what's funny about Adam. He goes in there and he definitely tears apart these people who are supposed to be in his same camp. I mean, I guess they're not in his same camp because he considers them anti-theists and he considers himself a Christian atheist. So I guess there are different distinctions there, and that's probably pretty important.
All these guys are so popular too in the anti-theist community. All they do, they're kind of hacks basically. All they do is parrot the anti-theist talking points. None of the stuff they have is really scientifically based. This guy has had videos from just a massive pseudoscientist. Like this guy wrote a couple books on cults. He's like a self-described cult expert, and you know he's been on CNN and stuff like that, but he hasn't done any peer-reviewed work. Like, he's not a respected member of the scientific community.
What was really hilarious is I did do a review of this guy, the activist here on my channel. What's he called? Genetically Modified Skeptic. So I did a review of a trip that he made over into one of the Mormon churches, and they were going undercover, pretending they were thinking about going to be a Mormon, and Mormon people were following them around, and they were acting all sneaky. And it was so funny because I think to myself, it's like the utter irony of having a person go into the Mormon church pretending to be a Mormon, pretending to be something he's not, and then getting angry that the Mormons were actually suspicious of them, because of course the Mormons were. They're wondering, why are these two young men filming themselves walking around our church, laughing, etc. So it was kind of an interesting thing.
Anything like that. He's just some huckster who tricks people into taking their money and getting their kids back from some cult that they fell into.
Skeptic, as I think he could tackle this much more adeptly than I.
Thanks, Drew. I want to continue the...
See, he's like Cosmic Skeptic. Cosmic Skeptic I actually like. Cosmic Skeptic seems like a serious guy, and I enjoyed his debate a lot with Michael of Inspiring Philosophy.
Yeah, Michael Jones did a really good job on a debate, and so did Frank Turek. I got to give Frank Turek kudos for his debate as well with Cosmic Skeptic. Cosmic Skeptic is, I have to agree with Adam on the assertions about Cosmic Skeptic. I say he's pretty, he's a smart guy. He actually got into Oxford based on his YouTube channel, which is kind of interesting. But he goes in there and he offers some interesting insights, but of course, he doesn't get into the deep insights on things. Like, for example, when he talks about things such as objective morality, he's not really giving us the fact of what is reality in our experience, our life experience, and the fact that we have self-evident truths. So anyway.
Jones.
Discussion. Each evidentialist may have underlying areas of interest, such as biblical criticism, the existence of Jesus, the resurrection, arguments from evil, arguments for God's existence and against them, the problems of creationism, or any combination of these.
Over the next few weeks, I'm going to respond to some of Dr. William Lane Craig's most popular arguments and assertions.
Now, this Rationality Rules, I made a video about him as well. He's another pretty popular British anti-theist. But one of the interesting things about him, this is Stephen Woodford, I guess his name is, one of the interesting things about him is he makes the argument we have no free will. And he uses, and I made a video on this because he uses this study that actually has been debunked quite a bit. And so it's to make that argument. So anyway, let's go and listen to what he says.
To begin with just a few that he's made regarding causation and creation.
Like with
the argument
here's what we have right here. We've got the 4 different categories of atheists, but as Adam has pointed out, and actually even as Braxton's pointed out, people can actually play any of those 4 parts in different times. So
William Lane Craig makes that I can't stand is obviously the moral argument, because I'm always pitching an evolutionary understanding of morality that will get us better outcomes in society. Like, that's my jam.
Yeah, that is his jam. And I got in there and discussed with him, but I would make the case that if we have objective morality, then there has to be a source of our objective morality. If objective morality transcends generations, eras, and people, as it does, then we would have to have an objective source that transcends generations, eras, and people. And so it's not grounded in evolution. Evolution can't explain why we desire truth, why we desire justice, equity, empathy, benevolence, universalism, which is this idea of appeal to the outgroup. So that can't explain that. So how is it explained? It's explained by having an objective moral standard of truth, which is God. And so he doesn't buy my argument, neither do people like Jonathan Haidt, but I think it's a pretty powerful argument as far as the moral argument. And William Lane Craig makes something pretty similar. And so, in just arguing, some people like to argue, they say, oh, well, I saw so-and-so acting like this, therefore objective morality doesn't exist. That is a non sequitur, because basically if you see somebody acting in some way, you're basically saying like, Johnny can't do math well, therefore math must not exist. You see how silly that is? So here we go.
So I don't think the moral argument is any good for the existence of God. Sorry, Christians, I know that bugs you.
Temperament category.
So we got the psychologizer, the activist, the provocateur, and the evidentialist, which I would say, you know, pretty much every atheist falls into these categories. So these categories, if every atheist falls into these categories become absolutely useless, Braxton. Sorry, I don't understand. Like, these are superficial traits that that these different people will show at various different times, but any one of the YouTubers that you showed could be in any one of these categories at a different time. So I don't think it's a good category set. I give it a fail, total F. Take this video down, delete this video, delete your channel. It's over for you. Obviously, I'm joking.
Most atheists will fall into all of these approaches at one time or other, but they do tend to have a primary and a secondary approach. For instance, genetically modified skeptic strikes me as typically an activist.
If you're in the
This is why they're all activists. Braxton, they're all activists. What the hell are they doing on YouTube if they're not activists?
One of the funny things, I think the approach of genetically modified skeptics actually is kind of similar to Shannon. It's kind of appealing to people emotionally, trying to say that, hey, we're the group you want to join. We're just this great group of wonderful people. And so see what he does right here.
closet, that's okay. A lot of us have good reasons for it. But I urge you to seek out a community of like-minded people, even just online, to help you cope.
But he also occasionally...
See, they love this. They're like, they're bringing... This is why so many of the atheists are social justice warriors, because the social justice warriors are LGBT activists. That's basically what they are. So this is why there's always conflicts between social justice advocates and other types of atheists. And I lay this out in my video. Of course, I do it almost... I do it like an artist. I do it very cryptically, and I don't know. You probably wouldn't get it if I didn't explain it to you, but I was new to YouTube. I didn't really know how to do things.
functions as an evidentialist, or at the very least brings an evidentialist in.
Quartery says ho. Cosmic skeptic actually studied but isn't very deep, but more formally disciplined, which is already a huge leap over the rest. Yes, I completely agree. Like he knows his logic. He's not inviting pseudoscientists on his channel to hang out. This guy doesn't really seem, this guy seems like maybe he was homeschooled. I hate to cap on uneducated people. It's so much of the world exhibits problems because people believe, well, and now I'm falling into the atheist trap because people believe weird shit. The world is terrible. I am in the science tribe. I don't deny it.
This is really easy, actually. Again, messages require
Guildmaster Skarma was homeschooled. Good for you.
only an
I have to
interpreter.
say, I have a new respect for people who are homeschooled because right now my kids have been home because of the coronavirus, just as everybody else's kids have been. And holy cow, this is not easy. I don't like it at all. And in fact, they just announced that we're going to be closed down. The schools are closed down. Of course, they have homework every day. They have to sort of self-teach themselves a lot of their stuff, especially algebra, because I know that my son is self-teaching himself algebra, and they don't hold classes during the school time, which is what I would think would be ideal. That's what I'm doing as a university professor. I'm holding my class exactly when it would have run if I were there in physical form. So I'm holding it from 12 to 1:50, for example, on Tuesday and Thursday, and I hold it Tuesday night as well. So that's the schedule. That's the way that I'm doing it. And I think it makes everything sort of normal. But the schools, the middle school and the high school, my sons are going to basically just, the teachers get in there in the morning and they assign a bunch of assignments for the week, including reading your algebra textbook, going and doing a bunch of algebra problems, and then uploading the problems at a specified time towards the end of the week. And so my kids can, they can bunch it all up in one day and try to get a bunch of stuff done, but it's not at all the same kind of experience, obviously, as they get in the classroom with the social interactions with other kids. They're not getting the exercise that they really need to get, like they would get if they were in school. Because my one son had 2 hours of gym, which I think is pretty amazing. And so he was playing basketball all the time. They don't even really want to go out and do a lot of that kind of stuff right now. And my other son used to go down to the basketball courts. Actually, both kids did that, but one of them particularly went down there. And right now, he can't go down to the basketball court, obviously, because it's all blocked off because they don't want kids down there catching coronavirus. And of course, I don't want them down there either catching coronavirus, but it's just rather unhealthy right now for everybody. Everybody's kind of cooped up inside a house, and it's just completely not very fun. But here we go.
To exist. If I gave an example of a perceived...
I could make an argument that I was homeschooled too, because I don't know that, I was kind of girl crazy when I was in school and when I was in college. So I don't know that I did a lot of learning in school or college. I think I did a lot of learning after school and after college. And, you know, just working as an artist, always listening to audiobooks. And that's basically where I got a lot of my education from. So.
Perceived message existing, but then being shown to be caused by natural forces, would that satisfy this question? It would, right?
Pine Creek seems to clearly fall into the category of psychologizer, but he also seems to be comfortable with the idea of being a provocateur.
Pine Creek is what they call a street epistemologist. So what he likes to do is he likes to ask these questions to try to jiggle up people's faith. And I find his approach to be a little bit off-putting. And I've been on his channel before, and I've commented on his channel a bunch of times. And it's funny, I just saw him actually, he had a girl called Laura Robinson on his channel not too long ago. Laura Robinson is a Christian and apparently the wife of a pastor, but she's got an extremely liberal approach to Christianity. And some of her views I completely clash with. And it was interesting listening to him because one of her things that she likes to do is she likes to trash Lee Strobel. And so she basically is making a claim that Lee Strobel's sort of a deceitful guy. And she did that. And so Pine Creek was so excited about that he brought her on his channel. It's like you could see the excitement in this guy's head as he brings Laura Robinson onto his channel to have her basically trash Lee Strobel. Now, as a Christian, it's not a good idea for us to get out there and trash our fellow Christians. I know people might say, oh, well, I'm going to go talk about Joel Osteen's $10 million house. Clearly, I don't think Joel Osteen should have a $10 million house. I think it'd be better to give some of that money to charity. However, I just want to say that that's between him and God. So he's going to deal with that between him and God. It's not really my position to start trashing Joel Osteen. Actually, I think some of his positive messages are pretty good. So here we go.
What I say.
Yeah, I mean, I would categorize Doug as an activist too, even though he doesn't really categorize himself as an activist. So I will not categorize him as an activist simply out of respect for Doug, because Doug I don't necessarily know how Doug would categorize himself, but
offends you.
I try to categorize people the way that they want to be categorized, just out of respect, basically, because I don't think you can really have an honest dialogue with people until you manage to form some sort of respect between people. And one of the reasons why I've never really had an honest dialogue with the anti-theist community is because there's no respect there. I think there was respect between myself and Shannon Q at one time. I think that respect was actually she had made a video and I was in the chat and I was joking around like I would joke around with the guys, and I think she misinterpreted it as me being legitimately hostile, which I wasn't. And that's the danger of chats. That's the danger of Twitter. That's the danger of a lot of these only text forms of communication that you have to realize. That's, you could type something and someone misinterpret that as honest hostility. I don't generally mean honest hostility until I do, which I try to keep it on in video format so people know where I stand. So after that, obviously there's no respect left after dealing with these people. I think there's still some respect between me and like Steve McCrae, I believe.
Steve McCrae is the other half of the Non Sequitur, and the Non Sequitur is the channel that actually kind of blew up. But I've kind of communicated with Steve McCrae a few times. I've had him on my channel. I think he's pretty straightforward. He is similar to Adam, though, in a way. It's funny that they get along because they're very similar. They both go in there and they shake cages. That's what they do, and it's really funny. And if you ever follow, especially Steve's timeline, Adam doesn't get in too many Twitter battles, but Steve is hilarious on Twitter. If you look at his timeline, if you want just to get a good laugh and to see, he'll spend hours and hours and hours clarifying the differences between agnosticism and atheism and how he's a temporal agnostic and he shouldn't be confused as an atheist. And he talks a lot about lack of belief atheists and how they're rocks lack belief, therefore rocks are atheists. I mean, he's just really funny. And so I would highly recommend looking at his stuff. And he just got in a debate on the Modern Day Debate not too long ago. And I saw part of it and it was pretty funny. So here we go.
But you don't really know until you touch base with the people. I think there's a lot of respect between Doug and I. I think Doug would have another conversation with me pretty easily.
Maybe consider the plausibility that there's something deficient in you first, that you have doubts, you have weaknesses, you have anxieties, you have fears, and this is why you're feeling this way. When I say certain words, when certain sound waves come out of my mouth, it hits your ears and it causes you to react in a certain way.
Okay, so that's what I wanted to see out of this particular video. So I'm going to stop right now. I promised as I went into this, let me just get back over to where you guys are. Whoops, let me get out of here. Okay, I promised when I got into this that I was going to also do possibly a review of a couple of other videos. But also another thing that I wanted to do, I want to say hi into the chat. I see Heartland Heathen, Jesse Camping, Sahi Luke, Brian Stevens, a lot of my faves, Stupid Whore Energy. Her name is Sarah, I think is Sarah, Illuminati. So anyway, thank you guys. I also wanted to, I'm going to probably go over to Nathan Ormond's channel because I was just listening to Camille on his channel, and this Camille guy completely cracks me up. I mean, he's so funny. So he's just, and I don't know, usually the reaction to listening to an atheist like Camille is to maybe get frustrated, but it's like he says stuff with a smile, and it just cracks me up. I wanted to, before I do that though, I wanted to talk a little bit about a reconciliation of the 4 passages concerning Jesus' empty tomb, because a lot of people over the years, especially people like Bart Ehrman, have made claims that you can't reconcile them, and I don't find that to be the case. So what you need to do is you need to first read the 4 passages, and then here's my point, how I would reconcile these. I said, to reconcile these, one must assume the gospel authors made mention of figures they felt were key in the narrative. If authors made mention of one of the women, it doesn't mean others were not present. If authors made mention of one angel, it doesn't mean others wasn't present. You can equate this with a sports reporter who focuses on the quarterback in a football game. We know other players were there, but to that reporter, there may have been minor contributors to the game. Furthermore, note that ancient writings often were not ordered chronologically. With the exception of Luke, the other gospel authors did not strike for an orderly account. So here's how I would put them together. While it was still dark, Mary Magdalene traveled to the tomb where she found it to be empty. So she went to tell the disciples, as reported in John. At dawn, as reported in Matthew, just after sunset, Mark, she returned to the tomb with other women, including Mary, the mother of John, and Salome, where they found the angels. Some of the women returned to the apostles and told them about the angels, while Mary Magdalene may have lingered. At this point, the apostles had reports from multiple women that the tomb was empty and or angels had appeared to them. These came from Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, Salome, Joanna, and others. So Peter and John ran to the tomb and confirmed that it was empty. Mary Magdalene started crying in front of the angels she saw in the tomb, according to John. Then Jesus appeared to her, telling her to go back to the apostles to let them know. Mary, the mother of James, joined her and they left, according to Matthew. Jesus suddenly appeared again. Perhaps this was for Mary, the mother of James's benefit. Mary Magdalene then reported to the apostles that she had seen the risen Lord. Question your assumptions if claiming the Gospels are conflicting. Assumptions are often built into this sort of conversation. One cannot assume the women traveled in a pack, as the Gospels don't make that claim. One can also not assume the women only traveled to the tomb once. The Gospels never say that. It's likely the tomb was the epicenter of their attention, given the situation. So I want to say hi to other people I see in the chat now. So John Lloyd and Brian Stevens and Veckel. Hey, Veckel. Good stuff seeing all you guys. So that is a reconciliation. Now, what I want to do now is I'm going to go look and see if Nathan Ormond is still on his channel, because I have to refute some of the things that Camille was saying. They were just so crazy, so crazy. And so let me just take a look, a little peek here. Whoops, wrong channel. Okay, let's just see, YouTube. Let me see if Nathan Ormond is still going. Aha, doesn't look like he is, but let me double check. And that means I can go into his thing and refute what he said. Okay, Nathan Ormond, here we go. Nathan, a lot of times, in fact, Nathan actually invited me on there to go chat about his stuff, but I'd already planned to do this video, so I will make comments about it. Why do when I see his video with Camille? Oh, Okay, I'm trying to find Nathan's video that he just did about Frank Turek. Okay, so let me just try that again. Maybe it's on a different channel. Aha, it's done, perfect. I can do a review, so hold on everybody. I'm gonna come back in here at 15 minutes because I believe that's when I'd heard the craziness begin. Okay, so let me just share this with you. Okay, so you can see what I'm looking at now. This is Camille Gregor. Now, what you want to do that makes this kind of fun is just look at Camille's facial expressions, because he just completely cracks me up. And when he's telling this story, it's so funny because I feel like he's not being serious. It's almost like he's kind of like a jokester. It's just really funny. Okay, here we go. Oh, let me make sure you guys can get the volume here. Yep, we got the sound on. Okay. Here we go.
Go back to the original Jesus, but there were still some people around, so it made sense to say they believe that the end of the age is going to be coming soon, so they just put that saying on the lips of Jesus. And there is another explanation. Like, it seems to be that in some cases in the Gospels, Jesus, like the character of Jesus, the author has the character of Jesus speaking, intentionally speaking, anachronistically. So Jesus is actually saying something, and it doesn't make sense given the time when the story takes place. But he's actually not talking to the people who are present at the time. He's talking directly to the audience of the gospel author. So it doesn't really matter that it doesn't make sense. It's like a literary device. Like, one example, I think, is in Mark when he says, like immediately after the transfiguration, when Elijah appears, Jesus is basically like indirectly identifying himself as the person who was prophesied as Elijah returning. And he basically says that the Jews did with Elijah whatever they pleased, or something like that. And it's obvious that he's talking about it in the past tense. I think in Greek it's in aorist. So he would be talking about something that hasn't happened yet, or that has already happened. But in the story, it hasn't actually happened because he hadn't been crucified. He hadn't been, like violently persecuted.
One of the things that I think is really important to point out about the Elijah, Moses, and Jesus transfiguration was something that's really cool. I've done a little bit of work recently looking at the book of Exodus, and I also read Phil Cotro's work on the book of Exodus, and he did a great job. He's got a great book. I highly recommend it. I'll probably put a link to his book in my channel so you guys can get access to that. But one of the things about Moses and Elijah that's pretty interesting is, and Jesus, is that Jesus's story completely parallels the Exodus. And so if you look at the Exodus and you look at this idea where the people they came out of Egypt. Think Jesus also came out of Egypt. The people were in the forest or in the wilderness for 40 years. And you have Jesus, when he went to get baptized by John the Baptist, he sort of came out of the water. God recognized him, said, "This is my beloved son," made known to everyone that this is his son. And then Jesus went to be temptation. Jesus went to be tempted in the forest after that. So Jesus went into the forest for 40 days. So just the equivalent is 40. Again, this number 40 always represents a change in the Bible. So anytime you see the number 40, you've got the change of the 40 years in Exodus out of Egypt, just like Jesus came out of Egypt. And then there was this change. Jesus came out of Egypt when he was young, and that's also been verified extra biblically. But the idea with the transfiguration also that's really interesting is that Jesus said just before the transfiguration, just before they saw that, he told them that some of the people standing there would see the kingdom of heaven. And then the verse right next to that was the transfiguration. So some people take that to mean that Jesus was talking about the end times, but Jesus made references to that particular time when he transfigured, and he also made references to the end of times, and he made references to the temple and the temple being destroyed. And so we know that the second temple was destroyed in 70. We also have to say that some of his disciples did think that he was going to come back in their lifetimes, but Jesus didn't say that exactly. He said we start noticing things. Now, the year that we're in right now, 2020, interestingly, if you add those together, that's 40. The coronavirus. We got some changes coming, okay? I don't know what they're going to be, but this is a time of change for us too. And so it's just something to watch. I know that people on Twitter, when I pointed that same thing out, got a little feisty, saying I was talking about numerology. How could someone like me refer to numerology? Well, I think if you look throughout the Bible, you're going to notice a lot of different, very similar things, like 3 days and 3 nights. That's something that was reflected by Jonah when he was in the mouth of the whale, the belly of the whale, for 3 days and 3 nights. And that's symbolic of going into the underworld and coming back out. So it's sort of a symbolism or a metaphor. And then we've got this idea of Jesus, after he was crucified, he sort of went down into the belly of the whale, if you want to call it that, for 3 days and 3 nights. It's an idiom. 3 days and 3 nights. It's how they referred to like a full day. They just said day, night, they kind of put them all together. So that's something that we see in there. And so this idea of when the end times are, as Jesus made clear, nobody knows exactly when that's going to hit. But we can look for things, like we can look for the fact that Israel has been resurrected after 1,878 years. That came about in 1948. So, and there's talk of a third temple. And so there's things just to keep your mind on. So, make sure you're thinking about that kind of stuff. So let's go on.
Executed yet. So like some scholars think that this is intentionally anachronistic. And this could be the same situation.
Like breaking the fourth wall sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think there are some other examples in the Gospel of John.
Okay. We've got SJ is in the chat as well now. Shall we carry on with the video then?
Absolutely.
Cool. I was in the chat.
My thingy size changed. And there we go.
Explaining it's going to be a terrible time. Judgment is coming. So it's not a false prophecy at all. In fact, I think it shows that the New Testament writers are telling the truth. And all the documents were written prior to 70 AD. Why? Because nowhere does anybody later say, look, Jesus was right. Why? Because it hadn't happened yet. The New Testament documents are written. Most of them are written, maybe all of them, are written prior to 70 AD.
Well, that's actually a thing that...
Here. So obviously there's numerous problems, right? Like when he's saying that the New Testament is not talking about the destruction of the temple post hoc anywhere, that's kind of up for debate, right? Like there might be some allusions to it, for example, in Revelation. And like he concludes from that, or that the entire New Testament, or almost the entire New Testament, might be written before then. But the question that like a historian needs to ask is that silence really unexpected on the hypothesis that it was actually written later? Like, do you really need the Gospel of Matthew to say, look, like, see, Jesus was correct, right? You don't.
They're going to talk a little bit about dating here, and I want to make some pretty important points. One of the things that we see in the book of Acts is we see that the author, who's Luke, so Luke wrote the book of Luke, obviously, and the book of Acts. They've been attributed to him by early church fathers and by a number of other people. There's no early ancient attributions to anybody else other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so that's one point. But another thing as far as dating is in the book of Acts, we have the two main characters are Peter and Paul. In the book of Acts, Luke documents the stoning of Stephen, which was he's considered the first Christian martyr, and Luke also documents the death of James, the son of Zebedee, who's the brother of John, who wrote the book of who wrote the Gospel of John. And so those two rather minor actors, as far as Luke is concerned, he documented their deaths, but he didn't document the crucifixion of Peter upside down, which occurred in the early 60s. And he didn't document the beheading of Paul, which happened by Nero in, again, the early 60s. Somewhere the estimates are between 60 and 64. So the assumption is that because he didn't include these two major characters, crucifixion and beheading, that the book was written prior to that. And so I think you can make a pretty good case that the book of Acts was written prior to that. And that, what does that do? That backpedals some things. So that takes you with Acts came, Luke came. Now Luke also people have considered Luke to be written after Matthew and Mark. So now we've got earlier dating for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that explains why, well, not John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but that explains a lot of the reasons why we don't see the destruction of the temple, because the destruction of the temple was a major event that happened in the early church. It was a big deal. It basically, Israel dispersed. It was no more. The entire country was gone. So it's not something you would not report if it occurred during your lifetime. And so one of the arguments that these atheists make is they'll say, oh, it had to be written after 70. Now, why do they pick the year 70? Because the temple was destroyed in the year 70, and they don't like the fact that Jesus portended that that was going to happen. So let's go.
That's one thing. Another thing is, so when you take, for example, the book of Revelation, which is normally dated to the end of the first century, it's dated to that specific point in time, so about 20 years after the destruction of the temple. Because, for example, Irenaeus, who is an early Christian author, says that the revelation was...
I just want to say, I'm looking at the chat right now. I do have that up so I can see that. And I see that Nathan is in the chat. Hey, Nathan, didn't you know I was going to review your video? I can't resist. Okay, here we go.
Not long ago, but almost in our own generation, at the end of the reign of Domitian. And Domitian was a Roman emperor who persecuted Christians, and he was assassinated in 96 CE. So there you go. Like, that's one piece of evidence for the dating of the Revelation. And what's really spicy about that, the same person, Irenaeus, is the earliest author who identifies Luke as the author of the Gospel of Luke, and John as the author of the Gospel of John. So, like, if that's not good enough for Frank Turek when it comes to dating of the Book of Revelation, he might be in trouble getting like strict support behind or evidence.
I don't get too worried or worked up about when the Book of John or the Book of Revelation were written. They were written, as far as I'm concerned, they were written by John, and they were written obviously in his lifetime. And so does it really matter if they were written even into the year 90? I've heard assertions that they might be written around the year 90. I don't think it really matters, but I do think it's really interesting to note that why wouldn't John have pointed out the temple's destruction in really anywhere? And so that's kind of an interesting thing.
Behind the traditional gospel authorship.
So for you, sorry if I'm interjecting your train of thought there. I'm not.
No, that's all right.
What would you say, like, are the earliest texts?
Well, the writings of Paul that we have, right? So
like
those
Romans.
are the extant texts. There might be some creeds where, like, there might be some instances where Paul is obviously like quoting some earlier material, probably not written, so that would be something that Christians were just like reciting and whatnot. But the earliest like authentic earliest extant writings would be the authentic letters of Paul, like about 7. Then the other ones and the other epistles are usually dated to the end of the 1st century.
And that would be like pre-temple destruction that you'd put on those Paul.
Oh yeah, Paul is pre-temple.
Okay, I would say I've seen Nathan says he can set up a debate between me and Camille. I would actually like to debate Camille, because I think Camille, look at his little expression right there. I think Camille is a character. Like, I actually think that he's sort of a jokester. And so I can picture him kind of laughing with a beer in his hand for some of the stuff he says. So we'll go on.
Police correction. Yeah, there are some places where he's talking about like basically the Jews coming, getting what's was coming to them. So that might be alluding to like him knowing about the destruction of the temple, but that's usually explained
Something that I think atheists overlook sometimes is they really don't look at certain passages that portended certain events. And so they might avoid that, but they also might not pay attention to things like Malachi 3:1, written about 400 years before Jesus walked the earth. Malachi 3:1 basically said that our Savior was going to appear in the temple. Now the temple's destroyed in 70. We suddenly got a timeline. And you've got Psalm 22, Zechariah 12:10, and Isaiah 53 made really clear that he was going to be pierced. Okay, and pierced for our transgressions, according to Isaiah 53. And so this idea was, these were put forward before the Persians had even invented this idea of a crucifixion. And so this idea of being pierced for our transgressions was really pretty amazing. And that was written about 700 years before Jesus walked the earth. Psalm 22 was written about 1,000 years before Jesus walked the earth. And so the Persians invented the crucifixion somewhere between 400 BC and 300 BC. That's what we have. So we've got this piercing occurring before. And so just take a look at that. You guys think about the prophecies in the Old Testament. Now, some people would try to make the argument, they'll say, well, oh shoot, I just lost the chat. Some people try to make the argument that they'll say that the authors wrote this in, but what would be the motivation of these early Christians to make anything up? They certainly weren't rewarded for this. Okay, they were basically, as I just told you, crucified, beheaded. Nero marched them around, used to burn them, and he made mockery of them, and that was documented by Tacitus. So we've got a lot of pretty bad things happening to the Christians. So if you say that Christians are doing this for their own personal benefit, you're not really being fair with the amount of information that we have. So here we go.
It might be alluding to something else, or it might be a later interpolation in the text. I think it's in 1 Thessalonians.
I don't know. I can look if it matters, but
no, it's right.
Carry on with the.
Yeah, I just like, it's really spicy for me that he's disregarding the same authority that he would be probably invoking if someone was doubting that the Gospel of Luke was actually written by a traveling companion of Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, there is one really interesting point. So if you think that most of the Old Testament or New Testament, all of the New Testament was written before 70, before the destruction of the temple. Then that includes First John, for example. And the First Epistle of John, is written specifically as refutation of Docetism, which was a Christian heresy. So Docetists believed that Jesus existed on earth. He walked around, talked to people, but he didn't actually have a physical body. His body was just like a spiritual. It was an illusion, basically, or the ontology of the body was different. Which, okay, that's...
Let me just get to the chat here because I see this question. There, I have this idea of being pierced. There's another word for it that refers to something like boring, through one's, boring like a hole. And so there are different ways that people have translated that. So it depends on which translation you go to, whether it's the NIV or ESV or something like that. The ISV, I happen to really like that new translation, the ISV. But different translations might say different things, but they all kind of mean the same thing, that there was a boring of a hole. And so that is a basic idea. And so I just want to point that out. And actually from what I've seen, the Dead Sea Scrolls supports this idea of piercing. So I don't know what Nathan's talking about here with Qumran, but I'll have to look into it. I could be wrong, so I don't want to bank on that just in case I am, but I'm pretty sure that I saw something that was consistent with this idea of piercing. So here we go.
That's all right. Like if usually the epistle is dated again to the end of the 1st century, when we think these heresies was already around. But if you think it was actually written before the destruction of the temple, then what you're saying is that even before the destruction of the temple, less than 40 years after the crucifixion, they were already Christians who thought that Jesus didn't have a physical body. That's what I call rapid legendary development. So yeah, you're kind of like shooting yourself in the foot in a different way there.
It's quite clear that in the book of 1 Corinthians, this is a really important book for people to see. In 1 Corinthians 15, in case you're not aware of this is an early creed, and even tons of atheists and agnostic and skeptics and deniers, or whatever you want to call them, even people who don't believe in the gospel's truth message, even if they don't believe in what Paul was saying in any of the epistles, even if they don't believe that, they'll say that 1 Corinthians 15 was written within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion. And that's a statement that Jesus appeared first to Peter, then to the 12, then to 500, then to his brother James, and then to Paul, the one abnormally born. And so we've got this early attestation of Jesus appearing. And through 1 Corinthians, he also mentions the physical form that Jesus was in. So we know that he's got a transfigured form, essentially, and that's attested to also when we look at things like Luke 24 and the road to Emmaus. In the road to Emmaus, we see that the disciples, including Cleopas, didn't initially recognize Jesus. So they didn't know who he was because he was in this different form. We also have that exact same thing coming from when Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. She wanted to hug him, but he wasn't he was in a different sort of form. She didn't initially recognize him. And then as soon as he opened, he said something to her, "Oh, Mary." She said, "Oh, Rabboni." So she knew who it was at that form. So he had a different sort of appearance. And whatever his appearance was, he also appeared to the disciples when they were in their shelter, all bungled up. And Thomas was doubting, and Thomas actually wanted to put his hand through Jesus' side. Now, what's a really interesting thing is what John says in the book of John about John is the one who makes a mention of the soldier who pierced Jesus in the side. Okay, so John makes this mention. He makes it really clear that all of a sudden blood and water came out. Now, this is very symbolic, and I don't know if you caught this, how symbolic this is, because the piercing in his side could correspond with Adam. Okay, the piercing corresponds with Adam. In different translations of Genesis, we have God taking a rib out of Adam and forming Eve. And so this is this idea of taking something out of his side. Certain translations say side instead of rib. And so there's a correspondence with the first man in that. And this idea of blood and water coming out of essentially the Ark of the Covenant. And so it's very symbolic because, again, he was the Passover lamb. All of this, going back to the book of Exodus, goes back to this idea of the Passover and the Passover lamb. And it had to be a blemish-free firstborn male. Okay, so Jesus was blemish-free firstborn male and the Passover lamb. He's the one who made a sacrifice. He actually appeared when he finally came out and announced himself sort of as the Messiah and was hailed as the king. That occurred on Nisan 10. That's the day that the Passover lamb was selected. Okay, so Jesus presented himself as a Passover lamb on Nisan 10. And then Jesus was crucified on Nisan 14. That is the day that the Passover lamb was eaten. Okay, so that was the day that the Passover lamb was eaten, killed and eaten, essentially. So it's chosen on Nisan 10. It was killed and eaten on Nisan 14. People have tried to look at different reconciliations of the different way that the Synoptics versus John told that, but they were in two different types of times. One of them was in Galilean, one of them was in Judean. And so we've just got different ways that they looked at time, whether the day started with the morning or the day started with sunset. So that's something just to note. Okay, so let's go.
Yeah. So actually, by distorting the kind of evidence to try and make his apologetics case stronger, he's sort of making it weaker.
Yeah.
Right. Let's see. Do you remember how long he kind of talked about New Testament and stuff for? Was it?
Subjectively for about 5 hours. Okay. Probably not very long. Okay. I don't have that many notes, so I think we should be able to fly through that quickly.
Okay.
Some scholars use to date Mark's gospel after 70 AD because it predicts the destruction of the temple.
Yeah, well, that's just what they're doing there is they're begging the question. They have an anti-supernatural bias, and they say he couldn't have predicted that. The problem is we know that Luke certainly is prior to 70 AD. Why? Because Paul, when he writes 1 Corinthians, is quoting Luke. And he's writing 1 Corinthians. Everybody agrees, even Bart Ehrman agrees, he's writing it in 55 or 56 AD. How can he quote a document that didn't exist? He's quoting Luke. And who does...
Wait, which passage is this?
Where does he
quote Luke in 1 Corinthians?
He quotes Luke. I'd have to go back and look at the passage. But he's quoting Luke's... description of the Last Supper. I think it's in 1 Corinthians. I'd have to go back and look exactly what I want to say. It's 14, but I have to go back and look at it.
Okay.
So, and J. Warner Wallace brings this out in his book, Cold Case Christianity.
Yeah, let's put here. I'm sure he does. So what's the problem there? So I think Frank Turek mixed up 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. So in 1 Timothy there 5:18, there seems to be a quotation.
Hold on one second. I see John Lloyd. Thank you, John. I want to say good, bad. Whoops. Dang it. No. Good, bad judgment is like people on an airplane that is going down. Wise people are going to put on the parachute, and some will be like, why this? Why that? Look at this. Why didn't they do this? And so, yeah, he's got a good point there. That definitely, it's one of those things where it's kind of like Pascal's wager. I know atheists do not like Pascal's wager, but this idea is, if it's true, we've got it made in the shade of pink lemonade. If it's not true, we're still good. I mean, we're still pretty happy. But I'm probably one of those rare people who's going to say that I am 100% positive that Jesus resurrected and this whole story of Christianity is true, based on my own personal experiences, but also based on the cumulative evidence that we have in support of that. We've got a lot of evidence. So I could get people in here, actually, if people are interested. I see Beckel in the crowd, and I love having Beckel come chat. And Nathan, of course, it's like talking about your video. So, but anyway, I'll just kind of monitor the chat if there is an interest.
From the Gospel of Luke. It's just one sentence. It says, those who work deserve their pay. And in Luke 10:7, it says like something similar. I actually have it somewhere. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide.
You can try screen sharing if you want, Camille.
Yeah, that's all right. It's just one sentence, right? Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whenever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. So there you go, right? That's like and I mean, scholars do think that this is the author of 1 Timothy probably quoting from the Gospel of Luke. The problem is, of course, that he mixed up two different epistles. Yes, but everyone agrees, as almost everyone does, that 1 Corinthians was written by Paul. But almost everyone thinks also that 1 Timothy wasn't written by Paul. And for very good reasons. Like if you want to know those reasons, go read the book. That's very well established.
It wouldn't really bother me if Timothy was written by a person who was sort of a disciple of Paul in a way. So I think that that's a possibility. It could be written by Timothy, who traveled with Paul and who was is beloved, considered like a beloved son of Paul. And so it could easily have been written by somebody else. It doesn't necessarily add any sort of, not saying it's unreliable because it might be written by somebody else. The church fathers went through pretty huge lengths to determine which of the book should be included in the New Testament canon. And one of the things that was a criteria is they wanted to make sure that we had eyewitnesses or people who knew eyewitnesses. And that's one of the reasons why they don't use the Gnostics and they don't use some of the garbage that came out later. They basically use the Gospels and the epistles because, again, we've got people who all traveled together at some point too. We've got Paul having interacted with Peter. We've got Peter, Paul, and John also interacting quite a bit. We've got John, who of course is the gospel author, the beloved disciple. We've got internal evidence that John wrote the book of John. Okay, so one of the things that we have that's only reported in John, which is pretty interesting to think about, one of the things that's only reported in John is he talks of himself being there at the feet of Jesus during the crucifixion. He was the only male disciple, apparently, who was sticking around there. The rest of them were all in hiding. They didn't want to be crucified or share the same fate. So John was there. He calls himself the beloved disciple, and he makes a direct reference to himself sitting next to Jesus at the Last Supper, again, as the beloved disciple. And we know from his book, we got details on that. John also was at the trial of Jesus. So for some reason, John was given access. He was able to go in there and watch the high priest try Jesus. He must have had a special position. Maybe his father had some special position with Caiaphas. I don't know. But what we do know is somehow John was given this access, and Peter traveled with him. But Peter was very fearful and was busy denying Jesus during this whole time, denied him 3 times, just as Jesus predicted. And then Peter ended up going into hiding. Now, think about, why did these people come out of hiding? What in the world would motivate them to come out of hiding? Because if they didn't see the risen Jesus, and as Paul has said, if the resurrection didn't happen, your work is futile. And so they saw the resurrected Jesus, and they saw him over a 40, here we get 40 again, a 40-day period. So you see how important this is. These numbers are very important. And just think about that. We've got a lot of times we're seeing different points in the Bible, the number 40, okay? I don't want to get too much into numerology because people get a little freaked out when I do, but I find this really interesting that we have some of the same numbers appearing over and over. So let's go.
And I like some improvisation from Frank Turek, right? So the Pauline depiction of the Eucharist is in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, not 14, I think he said, and the Gospel of Luke isn't quoted there. In fact, scholars think that actually in the Gospel of Luke, in the Eucharist section, in the description of the Last Supper, there is an interpolation. And it was specifically an interpolation made to align Luke with the other Gospels, because probably the Gospel of Luke originally, like the author of the Gospel of Luke, originally didn't believe that the point of the crucifixion and resurrection is atonement for sins. And one passage that's anomalous in the manuscripts is the one passage where it seems to be the text that we have today is affirming that view.
What did you think about his first comment where he said, the reason for dating it after is because of the anti-supernatural bias?
Well, that's actually really interesting because, imagine if you wrote if you found a piece of paper that was talking about 9/11, right? Like, what do you think is more probable? Do you think it's more probable that it was written after first 11, or do you think it's more probable that it was produced by someone with like a omniscience about the ability to predict the future?
It's kind of interesting that the Muslim bombers, basically, you want to call them, whatever you call them, the Muslim extremists at 9/11 chose 9/11 as a day to do that because that's the phone number that we dial if there's an emergency. So it's kind of an interesting thing. But I just want to talk about, yes, I do see a supernatural bias because Jesus predicted that the temple was going to be destroyed, and it was destroyed. And so, of course, a lot of people want to say later dating. They also say later dating because they don't want to give credibility to the Gospels. They want to pretend that the Gospels were anonymous, even though we have early attributions to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from a number of different sources. And we don't have attributions to anybody else. There's no gospel. There's nobody saying this is the gospel according to Anonymous, or this is the gospel according to Frank. It doesn't say anything like that, or the gospel according to Camille. We don't have that. We've got early church fathers pointing to the 4 authors. And another thing that a lot of people like to point out is they talk about extra biblical support. And we do have extra biblical support for virtually every aspect that's important about Jesus' life, including the fact that according to Josephus, his disciples claimed that he rose from the dead. Okay, so we've got that sort of a thing coming from extra biblical sources. Do the sources who are extra biblical, do they need to be non-Christians? Well, think about this. We have 32 sources in the first 150 years, 33 sources are Christian in the first 150 years, attesting to various aspects of the gospel message. Okay, so we've got these 33 sources. Now, if you were back in that period and you're honest with information and you heard about Jesus and you become a Christian, that doesn't mean that suddenly you're going to rule out the validity of these people's testimonies just because they took the information and they did what any honest assessor would do with the information, and they realized that Jesus resurrected. So whether or not you want to worship him as divine, or if you don't want to worship him, that's tangential. It should not have any play as far as your belief or your want to worship him doesn't have anything to do with whether or not the resurrection actually occurred. It did occur. The issue for you as the non-believing person is to look at the information critically, evaluate it, and make up your decision. So, okay, here we go. And Nathan, I saw you make mention of Joseph Smith. A lot of people like to make mention of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism or the Latter-day Saints. And one of the things about that is that Joseph Smith's early disciples, if you want to call them that, a lot of them actually recanted their beliefs in Mormonism, and they said that some of this stuff was made up. So even his own camp said some of that kind of stuff. And so I have respect for Mormon people. I have Mormon friends. I like the Mormons, what they do. I think that over in Utah, I think, except with the exception of those who are polygamous, but over in Utah, they're very industrious. They're hardworking. A lot of them serve as missionaries. They actually do that before they are in college or before college. I don't remember exactly when, but they're pretty good people. But that doesn't speak to the Mormon faith as far as whether or not it's valid. So we've got Joseph Smith making these claims about golden plates, and he's making claims about having Jesus during his crucifixion. Apparently, during those 3 days, he came over to America. I kid you not. I'm pretty sure what they think. Sorry if you're a Mormon in the chat here, but I'm pretty sure that's what you think. And I don't think that. And he has some angel called Moroni. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just like and that's what they wrote, right? Like you don't have to think it's impossible. I think even if it's possible, even if like people do sometimes correctly predict the future for supernatural reasons, it's still relatively improbable. It's much more probable that the reason why the text knows about the destruction of the temple is because that's already happened. And you can still believe, for example, that Jesus correctly predicted it. You just believe that it was recorded after it happened, right? So it doesn't even preclude the supernatural element.
So in case you just joined, it's a really important point, okay? The main characters in the book of Acts, Peter and Paul, their crucifixion and beheading was not noted in the book of Acts by the author Luke, okay? Why? The most logical outcome and reason for this is because the book of Acts was written prior to the early 60s when this occurred. Okay, so just make sure you remember that. If you're going to be honest with the information, you have to take what information is there. It's not that he wasn't recording people's martyrdoms. He recorded Stephen's and he recorded James's. So you can't make that argument.
Right. And actually, even like Christian authors pointed out that like from the literary point of view, it makes more sense if you're imagining that the author and his audience already know that the temple was destroyed, because in Mark, the point of prophecy and its fulfillment is to basically boost Jesus' authority. It's to show that he's able to like accurately predict the future because he's this divine being.
And he does accurately predict the future. In fact, Jesus predicts a lot of things. When we saw the temple in his own, in his same time. So that's just something that we saw. And we also, I want to say hi. Also, I see Slam and I see Sarah back in the thing, and she said the angel Moroni. Yes, the angel Moroni. So here we go. Okay, let's go.
So, yeah, I mean, that just fits the pattern that we see with other things, like him predicting that he's going to be crucified and then raised.
Well, so are there any other reasons other than that probability that people would use for that dating? So is it just...
Yeah, so that's a good question, right? So why do people date? Or what's the dating actually, right? So there is some data about that, because there is a non-Christian New Testament scholar, James Crossley, who wrote a book about it, about the dating of Mark. He's not a Christian, and he actually dates it very early. He dates it to, I think, mid-30s to early 40s. And but he, for reasons that Christians are not going to like, he thinks that Jesus preaches Torah observance. So you are supposed to still follow the Mosaic law. And there is an argument for why, from that, it follows that the Gospel of Mark was written early. And the way how he gets around the passages where it looks like Jesus is predicting the destruction of the temple, he says that those passages can be also explained by like there was an event in, I think, 40s during the reign of Caligula, when Caligula wanted to put his own statue into the Jewish temple. He obviously thought of himself, probably, that this might be a slander, but there's a possibility he imagined himself to be an incarnation of a god. So he wanted to have a statue of himself erected in the Holy of Holies, and that created like a backlash from the Jews, and this might be what's being described in those passages. I think it's Mark 13. But what I wanted to say is, in that book, he lists scholarship about the dating of Mark, and he specifically lists one scholar who wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, who went through all the scholarship about the dating of Mark before then. So you have like two sets of data, and you can compare it. So before 1911, there were 27 people who dated Mark before 70, and 25 people who dated it after 70. So it's about 50-50. And after 1911, there were 23 people.
So you notice the cut point here. It's almost correlation. Okay, so we've got the year 70. 70 is this year that really bugs these guys because the temple was destroyed. If you guys, there's an argument that some people have made that the book of Mark, they make the argument that it was first. A lot of it is because it's very short. It's shorter than the other books, and they feel like Matthew and Luke pulled some of the very similar stories from Mark. And they try to make the argument that Mark ended at Mark 16:8. And because there is some evidence in the Bible even that the later passages were added a little bit later. So Mark 16:9 and on, it's mentioned with that. But they ignore something really important that's mentioned before that, where it's the angel came out and says, and basically told him, he is risen. He is not here. Okay, so they ignore that passage, and they also ignore, because what they're trying to do, they're trying to make a narrative that Mark is first and everybody else embellished. That's the Bart Ehrman style argument. But they ignore the passage that says he is risen. And they also ignore Mark 14:62, where we have the reason why Jesus was crucified. Okay, so he gets up in front of the Pharisees. They kept saying, are you God? And he says, I am. And you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven and sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One. Now, why did he use that particular language? He said the right hand of the Mighty One is a direct reference to saying he is God. The Jews would have known that back then. It's also saying the Son of Man is a direct reference to Daniel 7. So he's identifying himself as God, and that's why the Pharisees tore their shirts apart and basically said, we've got to crucify him. Okay, it's because he said he's the Son of Man, Son of God, reference that. So I'm sorry, a Jehovah Witness or anybody else who is in a sect that doesn't think that Jesus was saying he was the Son of God, because he makes that quite clear. And if you look at the Jewish culture and you look at what Son of Man would have meant then, you can see it. And it's the word Son of Man, that reference is over 80 times in the Gospels. Jesus loved to refer to himself as the Son of Man. And again, that's a reference to Daniel 7. So, and speaking of Daniel, one of my favorite things about the book of Daniel, if you haven't had a chance to watch my video on it, is the fact that Daniel in Daniel 9 did talk about Jesus, and it actually gave us a start date. So we know from Daniel 9 that it's going to be basically 77s less 7 after the decree went out to rebuild Jerusalem. So we've got a few different options for when this decree could have gone out. The latest option is 444 BC. Okay, so if we start the start date there and we go and use 360-day Jewish years, that 444 BC and 483 years, because it's 77 less 7, takes us to the year 33. And actually, if you look at the exact dates and you go around and look at Ezra and look at Nehemiah and look at the different passages related to this Daniel 9 passage, you're going to see it actually takes us to the day that Jesus came out as the Messiah on Nisan 10. Okay, so it's actually going to take us to Nisan 10, which is why Jesus, a lot of times in the earlier Gospels, he said he would do a miracle and then he would say, don't tell anybody. He's like, it's not my time yet. He didn't come out officially until he presented himself as the Passover lamb on Nisan 10, okay, on Palm Sunday that we celebrate these days. We celebrate Nisan 10, which actually occurred on a Monday, but we celebrate that day on Sunday, okay? So that's the Passion narrative. So am I going to drink poison and handle snakes? Thou shalt not test the Lord. No, I'm not going to drink poison and handle snakes. But you remember something that happened to Paul, which was one of the things that really amazed people. Paul was bitten by a poisonous snake, and he was traveling. He was on his way. They were transporting him to Rome on a ship. They got off the ship and they went into this place, and Paul was bitten by a snake, and everybody sat and watched him, and they realized, oh my gosh, he was bitten by a snake, but he's not got any sort of evidence. He's not dying. It was a poisonous snake. And so, yes, we do have a lot of miracles that were coming out back then. And so the memes of destruction says memes of destruction like snakes. I hate snakes. I just saw one that was a very poisonous snake in my neighborhood. I forget, it's like the red, yellow, and black kind of snake, but it was in the way that it was poisonous. I took a picture of it and I put it on Twitter in case you guys want to see this awful snake that was in my neighborhood. I've seen that kind of snake in my neighborhood a lot. So yes, I have snakes and alligators and everything else in my neighborhood here in Florida. So if they want to come get me, they can certainly try, but I'm going to ride right over them if they cross my path at the inappropriate time when I'm on my bike. So
people, or 23 publications, scholarly publication, who dated it after, but only 9 who dated it prior. So you can see that like during the 20th century, it's shifted very much toward.
We have an issue going on in the last century and the century before. So I'm sorry, not the last century, in the 1800s and the 1700s, not 2 centuries. So we've got something going on in German scholarship. Is a lot of these Germans came out during that time and they opposed the Gospels and they opposed authorship. And this is when the first Jesus mythicists came about. Okay, the first Jesus mythicists came about around the 1700s. So well after Jesus walked the earth, these people come out and they try to pretend that this is just a myth, but we don't have good support for any of that kind of stuff. We've got evidence that Jesus was crucified coming even from the Talmud. And so we've got lots of evidence that Jesus was crucified outside of the Gospels. Josephus is another one who mentioned it. And we've got other confirming pieces of evidence. So that's just something to think about. But these Germans were doing that. And they also had this notion back in those times that the world is eternal. And a lot of the atheists love this idea of the world being eternal. And they liked it because it went against what the Bible said. The Bible said, in the beginning. Okay, so the Bible made very clear that there was a beginning. Now, the Vedas and other scriptures around the world have not said anything similar. In fact, the Hindu texts, Hindus believe that, and so do Buddhists, that we're in sort of this cycle, this everlasting cycle. Our universe is in this everlasting cycle. However, when the Big Bang occurred, and it was discovered and postulated in 1925. People now, scientists, support this idea of the Big Bang. One of the reasons why Einstein was hesitant to support this, and he had created his little fudge factor and had to get rid of it after he went and looked at the telescope, the Hubble, is because they're very leery of what Jesus. They're very leery of the what you call theological implications of a Big Bang and a start date, and that was very consistent with the Bible. 1911 was also the preparation between France and Germany before the war, Jesse Camping said. Yeah, Jesse Camping makes really interesting videos. So I want you guys to, and Nathan does too. Nathan, I'm going to put a link to your full video in this description here as soon as I get a chance. But Jesse Camping is, he looks into some stuff pretty deeply. And so I recommend that you guys go ahead and go into their channels and like and subscribe. If I've got other people here, Veckel was in here, definitely want to subscribe to Veckel. So that's something you need to do. So you just go.
Later date. It's not, probably not complete. Like he's just, that's selective, right? But, he's writing about it. That's the topic of his thesis. So I'm assuming he's dating, like he's representing the literature fairly well. And the question about other reasons for dating Mark, like after 70, the thing is that what Mark says about the destruction of temple isn't technically correct. He says there won't be like one stone standing on top of each other. But the problem is there is an entire wall of the temple still standing.
Wasn't that wall meant to be like a Roman fort rather than I don't know.
Obviously that's a whole debate, right? Like the Western wall of the temple is still standing. So he technically gets that prediction incorrect, right? And the question is if you think that's a significant data point. So the scholars who think it is a significant data point can they think they can narrow down the dating very precisely. They think that it could not have happened much sooner than 66, when the hostilities between the Romans and the Jews started. And it couldn't be dated later than 70s, because then the temple was destroyed. So the author writing after 70s would know that there is a wall still standing. But it's massively complicated. Like some people.
Okay, so I don't really have a comment on the wall still standing. I'd have to go look at the passage of Mark. Although a lot of the stuff that they mentioned when people do make mention of things like that in the Gospels is we do see some evidence of hyperbole in different cases. It's kind of like the idea that all of the Canaanites were going to be destroyed. It's like when you play football, you say we destroyed that other team, or all the walls. So you do see some hyperbole. The assumption that Camille has here, that's a faulty one, is Camille makes the assumption that they're just crafting this message. Now, again, let's go back to the motivations to craft a phony message about Jesus really weren't there. They didn't get any fame, fortune, women. They got nothing. In fact, most of them, with the exception of John, were martyred in pretty gory ways. Some of the legends go back and in church history, we go back and we look at some of the ways that they said they were martyred. Some of them were boiled, they're beheaded, they're crucified, they're burned. I mean, these people did not live an easy life. If you look what happened to Paul. Now, Paul was coming down the road to Damascus, and I don't know if you guys have ever noticed this part in the book of Acts that I just noticed for the first time. I glanced over it all these other times, but I noticed it, is there were 40 Pharisees in Jerusalem. Jesus talked to Paul, okay, not just on the road to Damascus, but Luke documents in the book of Acts that Jesus told Paul he needs to leave Jerusalem. So Paul was getting ready to leave Jerusalem, and 40 Pharisees took a vow that they were going to fast until they murdered Paul. Okay, so they were vowing to fast. That's how desperate these people were at this time to destroy the Christian message. They did not want their synagogue to have any encroachment from Christians. And so they were going after him. So you've got 40 people basically saying they're not going to eat until they kill Paul. So Paul went on and he kept presenting his case as a Roman citizen, and he kept doing what he did anywhere between, say he started around 33, 34, going all the way up to between 62 and 64, experiencing tons of times when he was stoned, he was whipped, he was jailed. He was jailed numerous times. He was shipwrecked. He was bitten by a snake. I mean, Paul did not have an easy life. And then finally, to top it all off, he's beheaded. So what would be the motivation for a man who had a lot of power as a Jew prior to the time when he saw Jesus on the road to Damascus, if he didn't actually see Jesus on the road to Damascus? Okay. And he said that he was blinded for 3 days. So there's probably some symbolism in with this blinding for 3 days thing too. Maybe even related to the 3 days with the crucifixion, of a time when you're sort of, you could say, fasting and that. And so there's some pretty important stuff right there. So I'm going to go ahead and I think I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this and go back to the chat and say hello to everybody. And if you guys have any thoughts or questions you'd like to add, we can certainly do that. Oops, let me get out of this. Thank you, Nathan, for letting me review this. So I'm going back to the chat. I'm looking at the chat, just see if there's any comments. Retaining wall was not part of the temple. Oh, okay. Okay, thanks, Susan. I didn't know that. So the retaining wall was not part of the temple. Yeah, he just created something that I was going to have to go investigate. So I did the Western Wall. And so I definitely appreciate that kind of thing. So would anyone have any points, thoughts, comments? So today I started off reviewing Adam Friended's video, then went over to Nathan's. I'm going to put links to both of those videos in the chat. And since Nathan was reviewing Cameron Bertuzzi, since he was reviewing Cameron's, I'll also put a link to Cameron's in the chat. So that'll be great. So I want to say hi, thank you, Stupid Horror Energy. I think, honestly, didn't you say your name is Sarah? I hate calling you Stupid Horror Energy. And Nathan and Jesse Camping, say hi to everybody. I saw Nathan's lady friend in here, so literally said that in the video. So what did you say in the video? Oh, you said the Western Wall? I guess I wasn't paying enough attention somehow if I missed you saying that. Yes, I do want to talk to Camille. I would enjoy a chat with Camille. I have no fear, okay? I would go talk to any atheist if anyone wants me to talk to them. I'll have a friendly chat with Camille about the reliability of the Gospels. I'd be happy to talk about that. I'd be happy to talk about if Jesus resurrected. That'd even be more fun. So I spend a lot of time talking about the evidence we have biblically, extra biblically, and historically for Jesus's resurrection. That'd be a good time. So, okay, so it was about the wall. Okay, so the wall wasn't there. That's it. It's interesting. So yeah, we'll have to go back and look at that particular point. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. Have a great day. I've got to go get back to grading. So you see, this is what I was doing to try to avoid grading papers, but I got to go get back to that. So I will see you all later. Yes, intelligent woman energy. That's a better way to say it, John. Thank you. Bye-bye.